this room is massive, and I'm going to attempt to deal with that while following on from Max. So I'm going to talk about our outcome study, which Max has kind of already mentioned, and also mentioned the main findings. So you've kind of got the ending already, but I'll take you through the process anyway. So the background Max has already given as well, in that relatively little is known about how the different services perform in New Zealand. And Ministry of Health funds both the National Gambling Helpline as well as face-to-face counselling services. And Max also mentioned the relatively weak evidence base for interventions generally as well. So we did the clinical trial of 4 interventions involving 462 gambling helpline callers, first-time callers, all of them. And one arm of this was that manualised version of the helpline standard care, which Max has already mentioned, and this outcome study is reporting on this arm. So we conducted a prospective cohort study over 12 months, looking in particular at outcomes for help seekers calling the helpline, and any differences in participant outcomes between those who accessed that telephone counselling alone and those who also accessed additional professional counselling services. And we were also interested in whether there were any client characteristics that were associated with treatment outcome. So this is an extension of that treatment as usual arm in order to look at it in more depth, and we also recruited an additional 34 participants who went in this study. So we had some eligibility criteria, including a minimum age and excluding anyone who was in immediate crisis and required police intervention. So everyone that rang was responded to by the counsellor in a brief kind of non-directive way, and if they were eligible, they were invited to take part in our study. And they were also assessed, and they went through an initial baseline assessment at that point and received the appropriate treatment. And as Max has mentioned, adherence to treatment protocol in our study was very, very high, and was assessed independently by 2 members of our research team. So we developed this standard care treatment protocol with the Gambling Helpline. This was really important in that we were trying to make sure that it was as functional and also as representative of their usual practice as possible, whilst obviously needing to differentiate it from the motivational interviewing approach that Max has mentioned as part of our clinical trial. So they, as part of the treatment, clients received brief screening and reflective listening, also referral and information. And we at AUT followed them up at 3, 6 and 12 months post-intervention. So most of our sample, well, more of our sample was female, and we had good representation of Māori and European, less so for Pacific and Asian. And attrition was an issue in our study, as I understand it is in a lot of studies. And we developed many different ways of trying to keep in touch with our participants at each stage over and above what information we collected at the beginning. And as Max mentioned, we're currently following up at 36 months, our original cohort, and the follow-up rate for that is sitting at around 50%. So we assessed gambling in terms of days per month, dollars lost per day, control. We administered the PGSI, measures of comorbidity and substance use, quality of life, treatment goal, self-efficacy, motivation, and perceived control. And it's kind of a happy story. For our gambling measures, there were substantial improvements from baseline to 3 months, and that these were maintained at 6 and 12 months post-intervention. So here you can see reduction in days gambling and dollars lost per day, as well as an increase in control over gambling. And the improvement can also be seen in terms of impacts on life areas of gambling, like work, social life, family, and health. So So at baseline, almost all of our participants were sitting in that problem risk, high risk category. And this reduced to 58% at 12 months. PGSI scores reduced from 17 at baseline to 9 at 12 months. So these are also really, really positive graphs as well. At baseline, only 2.8% were in the low distress category, assessed by K10, and at 12 months this had increased to 62.6%. And we also saw really notable reductions in major and minor depression disorder between baseline and 12 months, although we had less substantial changes for dysthymia and bipolar, which can be called more chronic conditions. So apart from drug use, other issues like smoking and alcohol abuse weren't substantially improved in our study. This kind of suggests that the interventions that the helpline are usually providing are quite specific to gambling, so that that particular manualised treatment seemed to have that effect. And as Max has said, uptake of additional services over and above that telephone counselling sat at around a third during the first 3 months post-intervention, and that declined to about 20% at 12 months. Males were more likely to access further services in the first 3 months, and that was regardless of whether they'd received treatment in the past. What we found quite interesting was that no other demographic variables predicted additional treatment uptake. So those who had received treatment in the past 12 months for either gambling or mental health were also more likely to engage in that additional counselling and therapy. So, crucially, there were no significant differences between those who accessed additional treatment and those who didn't in relation to PGSI scores from baseline to 12 months. So that's no additional improvement for accessing treatment over and above that additional helpline telephone phone call. And there were also smaller improvements for those who were sitting outside the paid workforce, so those who were disabled or on sick leave. An unexpected finding for us was that callers who gambled on pub EGMs improved much less than those who gambled at predominantly casino venues, whether they had additional counselling or not. And those with minor depressive disorder, and also those with a lower level of deprivation. So by deprivation, we're talking about financial hardship and poverty. At baseline showed greater improvement. So lower levels of deprivation, greater improvement. Participants' belief in treatment success was related to an increase in control, as was lower perceived difficulty in overcoming the gambling problem, which I guess makes sense. So in summary, we saw substantial, statistically and clinically significant improvements in problem gambling and also in some associated mental health issues. And these were seen mainly in the first 3 months post-intervention, and they were also maintained in the main at 12 months follow-up. And so we noted these improvements across PGSI score, self-reports of days gambled, money lost, control over gambling, and also impacts on various life areas and health. Also psychological distress, depression, and drug use. However, not for alcohol use and smoking. So the key here is that most of these clients only had that one helpline counselling session and did not access other more intensive counselling as part of their journey. So additional gambling treatment was not associated with better outcomes, although we note that this telephone intervention that we were working with was manualised and was closely monitored as well. And we also suspect that there is substantial variability in the kinds of treatment approaches that face-to-face service delivery are engaging in, and we acknowledge that we couldn't describe or account for the impact of these on our results. So unfortunately, we can't be entirely certain what our finding means, as Max was sort of discussing earlier. For example, it could be that additional treatment contributes little above that initial telephone session, or perhaps there is something going on there with the effect of those variables happening in the other services that we can't control for. Or it could be that clients are relatively able to determine what they need and when they need it, and that without additional treatment, those clients might have fared worse. However, we also note that it wasn't those with more severe problems that necessarily sought out that extra treatment over and above that helpline call. So some characteristics were associated with poorer outcomes for people, but usually only on one of our outcome measures. Pub EGMs as primary mode, I've already mentioned. Also living in high deprivation neighbourhoods. There's a list of the other ones there. So in relation to pub EGMs and deprivation, in New Zealand, the vast majority of these pub EGMs tend to be located in these high deprivation neighbourhoods. And we wonder whether accessibility might account for some of those differences that we saw in outcomes between those who are playing predominantly in pubs and those who are playing in casinos. And we can also see deprivation, illness, as perhaps limiting some of the, or at least affecting the kinds of leisure activities that people do take up or are likely to take up. So for me, this study was really exciting in that it was conducted in a real-world setting. Whilst being exciting, that also presented a lot of challenges as well, and I really like to acknowledge that its success is down to so many people, particularly our helpline partners, as well as our international research team and the students that we had involved in follow-up, and our participants themselves, of course. And also exciting for me in that we were able to really show outcomes for people seeking help for their gambling in New Zealand, and that these are positive and sustained. Noting, of course, the manualised protocol, as well as the unaccounted for impact of the variability of the services that people did access outside the helpline. So kind of in conclusion, most of our demographic factors had little or no association with our treatment outcomes. We note the small numbers of Pacific and Asian participants in our study, but we did have a really high representation of Māori. And those with gambling problems might be quite good at selecting the appropriate treatment for them. As Max has mentioned, this is, for ethical reasons and other reasons, this is an uncontrolled outcome study, so we weren't able to compare our results with what might have happened for people who'd received no treatment at all. But a key implication for treatment is that this relatively simple, accessible and economical intervention like this telephone counselling is associated with substantial and sustained clinical gains. And this is just acknowledging our partners and also our funder, the Ministry of Health.